But between
So thank you so much. Okay, good? Okay. We're gonna figure this out.
I should find out how that works.
Yeah, my dad, I'm technically.
Yeah, my father was also.
Might as well, depends on all of this.
He was a psychologist. The kind of biology from Debbie.
I grew up in the field, I used to put that in the field. I think that led me to archaeology. We all remember that.
Yeah. Of course, it led me away from the sciences that I had to prove that.
I mean, also towards people.
Yeah.
Although animals keep bringing me back. I'm quite similar as you, but I find, especially when I'm running a project, I undergraduate students, I tend to get more that way.
Oh, right, well, glad.
Yeah.
It's just these last week.
Have you read Pro? It's all right. I think particularly it would be good for undergrad. Very, but yeah, it's fun. I would say I would target for that book. I think it was the target book. It's very much the same. Okay.
Someone's got red shoulders.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You have reactions. It's just like my red fly. It's how are you? Yes.
Those are, it's not like roots, like.
Oh, last week. Yeah.
They don't feel like this. I'm getting desperate. Can we get a new friend?
I get your comments. Brad.
Than the one that's for, you know,
Yeah.
You did a one paper. Yeah. My daughter.
Yeah, you can try to break it. A lot, but they're not. Shifting gear. Giving a further look, giving a more.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see everyone. I think we have as many people online as we do in the room, which is always nice. Welcome to those of you on Zoom this afternoon. It's a very special occasion today, not only because it's our first colloquium of the year, but also we have a visitor from Ghana, which is very special. And thank you to Lakisha David, Professor Lakisha David, for inviting Dr. Saboro to join us this afternoon. Lakisha has been working with Dr. Saboro on her research in Ghana. And luckily for us, Emmanuel was coming to Indianapolis this semester as a scholar, and we were able to just jump on the bandwagon and get him over here for this afternoon. He's actually going back to Ghana at the end of the week, I think he said. So I'm just going to turn the floor over to Lakisha to introduce Dr. Saboro, and we're really looking forward to sharing your expertise. Thank you.
And thank you for everyone who is attending in the room and online. But thank you to like the office staff and everybody and faculty who rallied at the last minute to help put this together. Thank you so much. And I really hope that to have some really engaging conversation. So I'm honored to introduce Dr. Emmanuel Saboro, Associate Professor of Transdisciplinary Studies. Sorry, like ages. Yeah. What is this? Okay. Studies at the Center for African and International Studies, University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And it was during the summer when Mackenzie and I was in Ghana collecting saliva samples that met Dr. Saboro, and that's been a real treat. He specializes in African literature, cultural memory, and slavery studies, and currently serves as the director of the center. He did his doctoral degree at Wilberforce Institute, if I pronounced that right, for the study of slavery and emancipation in the University of Hull, England. Turns out it's a small world. Brenda be very familiar with there. His research centers on the enduring impact of mass human trafficking from Africa, with a focus on decentralized societies in Africa in late 19th century northern Ghana. So Professor Saboro has contributed to the academic discourse with numerous articles and book chapters published in international journals and edited volumes. He has been awarded fellowships the African Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Society. Also, visiting scholar, was mentioned a moment ago, but also at Brown University, Foreign Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies in Germany, and some others. His most recent book is Wounds of Our Past, Remembering Captivities, Enslavement, and Resistance in African Oral Narratives, published in 2022. This book delves into the continued practice of slave raiding, dealing, and labor in Africa into the 20th century, long after the transatlantic slave trade officially ended. So he's using oral sources like songs, proverbs, names, and everyday sayings. Dr. Saboro offers a fresh perspective on using non-conventional and conventional methodologies. So I'm really looking forward to what's sharing today. Yeah, so his research not only is academically enriching, but also personally empowering, right? And from the immigrant perspective. So as he likes to say, we talk about the transatlantic slave trade usually from an African diaspora perspective, and that is very true in our literature and our research. But we should, shine light and focus on, demand perspectives and African perspectives as well. So I will open it up to you.
Are you going to help me navigate him through the system for me?
Do this, you can just put this up. Start this. Begin.
Are you sharing the share screen?
Or to the share screen first.
So why should I speak so that the sound will be better? Here is fine.
Yes.
Okay.
Where's the share screen?
You have to get Zoom, PowerPoint.
Have to bring Zoom. Oh, it's here. There you go. I got rid of it. There we go. Is that right?
I don't, you click all the way through to OK, or just click the. I didn't see it.
You didn't see it? All right, let's try again.
Do you mind if I?
No, share. Share,
And then put the share button down here.
share.
There you go.
All right. Thank you. What do I do with that now then?
So would you be able to check them as I go along? So that when I took classes in PowerPoint, they said, get the audience to focus on the speaker and not the slides. So maybe you could just sit down and then as I speak, you could just navigate through.
Is this on?
It's not button?
Do you have the part that's connected to the?
No, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I think we have to use this one, because anyone know how this one?
No, just.
Yeah. Would have to use these.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, all right,
And so this will be the one that we can see here, and this is the next one.
okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right, so I bring you greetings from Ghana. Like Dr. Lakesha said, I've been in Indianapolis for the past 1 month. Maybe resting and writing. I'm working on my second book. So I just got a short fellowship and then I came to Indianapolis. So when she heard I was there, she said, no, why don't you come around? So I'm happy to be here this afternoon. So before I start, let me establish two caveats, two important caveats. The first is my accent. You would know that I'm typically Guinean. And so I might not speak like, somebody from the West. So just, if you don't hear, you don't understand anything, just draw my attention when I finish. The second caveat is that forgive me if I'm not familiar with your pronouns. I'm still getting used to the system. Once in a while, I make some mistakes and slips here and there. That's part of my cultural, issues. So having said that, I want to thank the head of department for anthropology. This morning, we had a very fruitful discussion in her office. And we share a common identity because I studied in Hull, and she told me she grew up in Hull, and so it was a nice thing. I also want to thank Dr. Lakeisha, whom I first met in Ghana some months back. She's doing some very wonderful work. And I'm very excited with the work she's doing because some of the samples she's taking from where I came from, or my local community. And so it's great to know that there is that connection and that some of my brothers and sisters ended up in the States. And that is part of the broader discussion we are having. Like she said, in 2022, I published my first book, Wounds of Our Past. It's on Amazon on some of the book outlets. It's actually a revision of my doctoral dissertation at the University of Hull, and where I looked at how African oral sources enhance our understanding about late 19th century enslavement within African oral narratives. And so we're basically focused on songs coming from the communities that were raided in northern Ghana and how they continue to remember that part of their history. And that formed the basis of this work. And so my career trajectory actually has been closely associated with how memories of enslavement is kept alive in African oral traditions. And I come into this discussion with a different methodological approach from conventional historical methodology, because I know that most of what we have come to read and to appreciate about the slave experience in Africa more broadly, and even within the Gold Coast, the history of slavery and the slave trade has been written largely through European lenses. Have been largely written through the use of conventional historical methodology. Europeans have written the history of Africa from traveler logs, from written accounts, from missionary records, from colonial records, and all of that. Now, although that is important, but part of the problem is that earlier anthropologists and scholars who studied Africa did not understand the cultural nuances of Africa. And so therefore, they made certain very broad generalization about the people. And so when I began this project, I felt that it was time for us to try to reconfigure the nature of the archive. Because when Europeans and when scholars of the West talk about the archive, they are talking about a building that houses documents. In Africa, there is a way in which we understand archival deposits rather more differently. Our archives are in people's memories, passed on from one generation to the other. Our archives are resident in the songs that we sing. Our archives are in the names that we give to our children. Our archives are in architecture. Our archives are in the proverbs. And then our archives are also found in our stories. And all of these are legitimate forms of knowledge construction about Africa. And so I thought that it was important for us to begin to study the history of slavery and its impact on decentralized society using indigenous sources and using the voices of the people who were largely affected by the trauma of enslavement. And I've said on many occasions that usually when we talk about the trauma of the transatlantic and internal African slavery, we usually focus on the trauma as it applied to the people who ended up in the diaspora and in the New World. And legitimately because we are able to see the visible signs of American racialized society. And so therefore, we look at it in terms of how the legacies have impacted Black people within America. But as a continental African, it's important for you to realize that indeed, the trauma of enslavement and the slave trade was central to the identities that we forged in Africa. We were the people who lost people. We were the people who lost brothers and we lost sisters. And we lost aunties and we lost children. And it was our people who were carried away. And so when we reflect on the trauma as it affected the people who ended up across the Atlantic, it is also important to look at it from the perspective of those of us who were left behind. And that is why I think that what I'm doing is a bit innovative, because I'm trying to center the voices of the people who were mostly affected by slavery in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, the slave trade and enslavement has been considered as a monumental catastrophe. and its impact continues to resonate in many African societies. In fact, this traumatic event is said to have occurred spanning a period between 366 to almost 400 years. Now, Ghana, or the Gold Coast as we know it by history, now Ghana has been intimately connected with this history. And I know historians and scholars have written a lot about Ghana's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. But it is important that even before I come to today's lecture, I try to establish some kind of context, because not all of us would have read the history of Ghana, not all of us would have read about the transatlantic slave trade, and so on and so forth. So context would be useful for my purposes. So let me just try and see if I can sketch Ghana and the slave trade. I might attempt to look at the numbers debate and talk about Northern Ghana internal African slave trafficking in the 19th century. I will be talking about places and sites, and that is the focus of my lecture, because what I'm going to be sharing with you today is actually a chapter from the book that I'm writing to look at the ways in which sites and places can tell us stories. And then I'll look at space, ritual, and symbolism, focusing on a particular site in Ghana. Now, I'm going to leave these photos just on the screen as I speak, because I will come back to these photos in a while. Now, so when we talk about the Gold Coast and Ghana and its role in the transatlantic slave trade or African internal systems, what is it that we know already? Historians have spent some considerable amount of time writing about the history of the slave trade within the Gold Coast. So almost over the 400 years of the dark history of the slave trade from the 15th to the late 19th century, scholars have suggested that indeed about 12.5 captives were displaced through the Middle Passage into the New World. A staggering 1.8 million of them are said to have died and their bodies thrown into the sea for sharks. Yet, regrettably, these numbers do not tell the entire story. They represent only fragments of what has remained within the historical record. The lack of documentation makes it impossible to speak about numbers. So a conservative estimate, about 15%, would also include those who died in transit while being imprisoned in the slave dungeons in the coast, awaiting transatlantic shipment. So the period between 1700 to 1808 is often described as the golden age of this dark history, because it was when more captives were transported than any other time in our history. Within this period, over 40%, or at least 3 million, were shipped in British or American ships. Now, Ghana is such an important space because, as I talk to you now, Ghana now has about 60 slave forts and castles dotted across its coastal line. That makes Ghana an important space for the construction of historical memory connected to the slave trade in Africa. So the Gold Coast, now Ghana, became one of the leading suppliers of African slaves to other Atlantic markets in the first half of the 18th century. So if you look at the slave voyages database, for example, it records that the Gold Coast was a place for the origin of 9.7 people, or 9.7% of captives departing from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. The historian Paul Lovejoy has suggested that the volume of slave exports increased dramatically from the 16th, 17th to the 19th century. Over this period, the transatlantic slave trade, according to Lovejoy, accounted for over 70% of all exports from Africa. So for a greater part of the 18th century, Lovejoy tells us that the trade was concentrated in the Gold Coast, the Biat of Benin, the Biafra, and the West Central Africa. These areas accounted for about 88% of the total slave exports from Africa, out of which 14.5% came from the Gold Coast. Now, this tells you that indeed, the Gold Coast was an important space relative to the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the major destinations of all of these captives, about 58% of these slaves from the Gold Coast, Jamaica received more captives from the Gold Coast than any other colony in the British Caribbean. 29%, while Barbados received 13.5%. Now, the problem with these numbers of statistical quantification is that usually it does not humanize the experience of the enslaved. we historians and scholars have just reduced the experience of the enslaved by just giving the arithmetic numbers. Now, we also know about the trauma of the Middle Passage. We know of the destination of African captives in the New World. At least we also know the nature of American plantation slavery, both in America and the Caribbean. We know of the legacies of American racialized political and cultural landscape. And in fact, scholars, particularly David Richardson and Eltis, have given some statistical data. And I think that is important because then it helps us to be able to understand the impact of both the transatlantic and the internal slave trade within Africa. Now, if you look at the data that we have from David Eltis and Richardson, the estimated number of slaves that were carried on vessels leaving the largest 20 ports of embarkation in Africa between 1501 and 1867. I am interested in the ones that transited through the Gold Coast. 318,000 went through Cape Coast Castle. And for those of you who know, Cape Coast Castle is one of the major European fortifications that we have now, and is a place that draws a lot of attention because we have tourists coming from all over the world trying to connect with their African ancestry and go through the Cape Coast Castle, the Ndila Castle, and the Anumabo Castle. There are other castles, but these castles are quite popular or famous. So 318,000 went through Cape Coast Castle, 255,000 passed through the Elmina Castle, and then 466,000 went through the Anumabo Castle. Now, Anumabo is important because scholars tell us that the African internal slaves that were captured by Asante passed through the Anumabo Castle. And many of them ended up in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and so on and so forth. Why is Northern Ghana important? And that is why Dr. Lakeisha's work is important, because Northern Ghana is an important space because usually when we talk about the trauma of the slave trade, whether internal or the transatlantic, we know that slaves did not originally come from the coast. They came from the hinterland or from the interior. Northern Ghana is usually considered as the hinterland, where the majority of captives were captured. There have been debates by scholars as to the exact period in which Northern Ghana became part of the slave trade. And I think that by the time Dr. Lakeisha would have finished with her genetic work and all of that, it will settle some of those controversies, because indeed, there is evidence to begin to show that a greater number of people came from Northern Ghana and ended up in the diaspora or in the New World. But what we know is that Northern Ghana became part of the drama of the slave trade largely at the latter part of the 19th century when we had Zabarma slave raiders with Asante slave dealers. You know, Asante is one of the ancient kingdoms that were very actively involved in slave dealing and in slave raiding, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, there's evidence to suggest that indeed Asante exacted tribute. In fact, some scholars say it was a debt, others say it was tribute, but whether it was a debt or it was tribute, the underlying thing is that Asante northern communities or Northern Ghana, particularly the Dogobans, were required to pay an annual tribute of 100 slaves every year to the Asante Kingdom. And they got these slaves by raiding the centralized communities in the hinterland. And that is why Northern Ghana is such an important space within our discussion. Now, I usually would come into the discussion of Northern Ghana because I have an intimate connection with the people. That is where I come from. And I come from the areas that were raided. And so for me, this is just not an academic exercise, but it's also an emotive, kind of work, because it was my ancestors who were raided. So I come into this history with an intimate connection with the people. I guess that 1 hour or even 2 hours will not be sufficient for us to be able to exhaust the entire discourse that surrounds this kind of emotive history. But when I began field work collecting oral history from these communities, I mean, you would find that usually when these communities are singing about their experience of enslavement, it's such an emotional and moving spectacle. There are songs that are patterned after the African dirge tradition. There are funeral songs, and there are songs that are usually performed when people die. And it was quite strange that when I was doing field work, and anytime I asked them to reflect on the impact of slave raiding, they would begin to sing these dirges. And I asked them, well, why are you singing funeral songs? What's the relationship between a funeral song and slavery? And they said, well, the whole experience of slavery was death. Death of a people, physical death, psychological death. And so anytime there is a funeral, they would have to relive these experiences, which is why the funeral dirge is an important cultural repertoire within these people. What have I been trying to do in my second project? Now, when we used to read African American literature, we were introduced to Toni Morrison, and Toni Morrison has written quite extensively about slave memory and experience and all of that. Beloved is an important text in which Morrison tries to recreate the trauma of enslavement, particularly within the context of transatlantic plantation slavery. And in Beloved, there is a portion that I got interested in. Toni Morrison says, and I quote, "Some things you forget, other things you never do. It's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the picture of it stays. It's not just in my memory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around inside my head. I mean, if I don't think of, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there." It's important to frame this larger discussion by looking at places and sites that still hold the history and the trauma of enslavement. And it's for this reason that I aim to call for a reading of the hidden and lost stories of some of these key historical and cultural sites and spaces that are connected to the slave experience in Ghana, beyond just their structural representations. Because today, if you go to northern Ghana, right from the places where slaves were captured to the places where they were marched to slave markets, even before they finally ended up being imprisoned in the castles before they transited on ships, these sites are still visible. And I know that archaeologists and architects and people who are interested in material culture have done some tremendous work trying to unearth some of these hidden sites. But what these scholars have done, architects and archaeologists and people who are interested in material culture, and even for some historians who are interested in these sites, I realized that they usually will be using these sites just to give some evidential value to the text, the written text or the written books. So you see photos of these pictures in books just to say, well, this was the site. But are there ways in which these sites can speak? Because the environment we usually encounter at historical sites are usually very rich in objects and artifacts that hint at deeper stories and context. But these sites and spaces usually lack rigor, at least in terms of historical and interpretive methodology. So what I've been trying to do is to build on Nora Pierre's frame. Nora Pierre is a French historian who was one of the earliest to coin the term sites of memory. There have been debates about whether, criticisms about his frame, and that people expected that he would have used slavery and colonialism as part of his frame. But I think the phrase sites of memory captures essentially some of the things we've been trying to do, to look at sites and places that are connected to this dark history. So stories or historical environments are very powerful when the stories that they generate come from the settings. Because stories help us to make sense of the world, including what happened in the past. They help us to know and understand that others have struggled before us. Stories have the ability to teach us on a deeper emotional level, and therefore stories provide a fundamental key to learning. Spaces have the potential to tell a story, and through these stories, they are able to forge deeper connections with the people who experience the events. But in spite of the many tales that we have heard about enslavement in Africa within mainstream historical writing, many stories still remain hidden and have never been told. And these slave sites themselves have been a very neglected area within the body of work. So this project is intended, therefore, to tell the stories of what has remained behind in sites and in spaces. It does this through a historical trajectory, mapping enslavement from captivity from the hinterland to the coast, tracing this history through an intimate exploration of these sites and spaces so that we might be able to uncover some of the hidden stories that have been buried. Now, if you look at what you see on the slide, you would find remnants of some of these spaces. What you find in the first slide is a remnant of a wall. Now, at the height of slave raiding in the latter part of the 19th century, communities had to find ways of insulating themselves and resisting slave raiders. And so all over Africa, the construction of fortifications and buildings and reconfiguring architectural designs in order to be able to adapt and to lessen the impact of slavery was a common theme. So you still find the remnants of these walls that have been preserved and left in these communities. So if you visit a community that had this kind of history and you ask them, what is this wall about? They have about 300 years of history to tell you about the wall. But beyond people telling you the history about the wall, if you were to listen intimately to the wall itself, what story do you think the wall has to tell you? Are there ways in which the walls can speak? Are we able to listen in the silences? Because the challenge with our Eurocentric methodological frame is that usually we are looking for evidence in text. We are looking for evidence in the archives. These are legitimate approaches. But is there a way by which we can move from some of these conventional ways to listen intimately to these sites? And that's the kind of ambition I'm trying to explore. And I know this morning I was having some discussion with the chair of African Studies. And, we kept talking about whether indeed, I think there's something on the computer that makes it difficult for me to navigate into the other slides. I'll come back to this. Yes, please. Now, Salaga was an important space in the Gold Coast because it was a market center that attracted a lot of traders from the West Africa sub-region, from Hausa traders who came to Salaga to trade in hides and kola, and in fact, eventually also came to trade in slaves. Salaga became a market where slave raiders who were raiding the other slides.
It's looking for an install now situation.
Okay, so that's all right. So that's fine. It's okay.
Okay,
that's all right. That's okay. So Salaga was an important commercial center that attracted a lot of traders from the West African sub-region. And it became a main center where slaves were sold. So Asante slave dealers from the coast would often go to Salaga and buy slaves and then take them to the coast. So today, Salaga has become an important space that attracts a lot of people from the diaspora who go to look at it and tour. I'm usually very reluctant to use the word tourism, but of course that is what it is. But for those of us who are, researching in such an emotive history, we just don't want to consider these places as tourist sites. They have become sacred sites where people want to connect with a traumatic past. So if you go to Salaga today, you would find attempts by the community to preserve the history. And the preservation of this history is important, not just for the formation of historical memory and identity, but it's also to allow us to go back and ask questions at these sites. And these are some of the questions that I've been trying to ask. And it's going to be very difficult to get a tree to talk, but it's important. So you will have, these are wells that captives dug whilst they were being confined in Salaga, waiting to be marched to the coast. and they had to find ways of sustaining themselves by digging wells to have water. I mean, what you see now is a much more modernized form because at the time, this is done for tourism purposes. But if you go to Salaga, you still find the original wells as they were at the time that these spaces were there. Unfortunately, I think the system is frozen. Otherwise, I would have shown you the guava tree. And I want to talk a little bit about the guava tree. The guava tree is an important tree. And strangely enough, almost all slave transactions were done under the African guava tree. I don't know whether you have the guava tree in the US, but it's a very big tree. And usually there are spaces within the tree. And unfortunately, the slide is not able to show it, but I have the guava tree in my book, and I think it's important for the purposes of emphasis and for the purposes of argument. Good. This is how the African guava tree looks like. Are you able to see it from there? All right. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, I'll get it out. I should just quit.
It's okay. Because I wanted to click this here. I don't know whether it can show.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I don't know why it's doing that. You carry on, I'll just skip it.
So some of these sites and spaces, apart from the wells, you will also have is it frozen? Something needs to be installed or something.
Okay. Right. It's just, I just told it to quit. I think you might need to force quit it. Right. That's quit. What? Okay. There you go. There.
Good, good. Yes, so these are still important sites. The two men you see here performing on the rock is exactly the place where Dr. Lakeisha was. This is the Picoro slave camp. It used to be a camp where slave raiders kept slaves waiting to be marched to Salaga before the coast. And so today, if you go to this space, you will still find rocks that the community people use in performing music. And engraved in these rocks are places where slaves could eat. They didn't have plates at the time, and even they had, no slave could have access to a plate. So they had to find ways of carving. Is that the word to use? Plates on the rocks. And so you still find material reminders. For those of you who are archaeologists, that is an important thing to explore. So you still find these rocks having spaces that look like bowls. And the camp is huge. So in the camp, you have punishment rocks where slaves who were recalcitrant were tied to certain rocks and were made to face the sun from morning to evening. There's a burial ground there. Slaves who died whilst on transit were buried there. And so today, if you go to this community, you still find people who would come and perform. And part of the community oral history is that enslavers had to find ways of keeping these slaves active and to lessen the impact of captivity by causing them to sing and to dance. Whether they were happy in the dancing or not, but that is another issue. But part of the psychic was to tell them that, look, don't worry. Although you are captured here, you are going into a better land. We are taking you somewhere. You are going to work. You are going to get food to eat. So don't worry about your plight for now and all of that. That is what has survived within the community memory. Now, it is important that I show you this picture because the ways in which I already spoke to you about the ways in which Africans understand the archive. Now, this music and these performances are usually passed on from one generation to the other. A week before I came to the US, when I visited this same place, these two people had died. They are no longer alive. And this was something I recorded sometime between 2012 and 2013. But their children or young people within the community have taken over from these people. And now when you go to the camp, you will find much younger people performing some of these songs. Now, the reason why I am interested in this camp is because the camp still has a lot of stories to tell us. The trees have heard a lot. The rocks probably have heard a lot. And I guess it is not all of the things that scholars have written that we know about the entire story. Now, these rocky outgrowths you see as part of the topography of the areas where slaves were raided. And in my earlier book, what I tried to do is to try to get people to understand the ways in which people had to adapt to their conditions of enslavement. Not everybody had the means to fight physically back. Some people had to adapt ways to lessen the impact of captivity by running into inaccessible areas. Slave raiders were often on horseback. Is horse a common thing here? Yes, in the Sahel regions and in some places where slave raiding was quite common, most of the slave raiders were usually on horseback and chasing their victims. And so communities had to find ways of running into spaces where the horse could not navigate. So today, if you get to these places and you are trying to reconstruct memory, they tell you that these are places where our ancestors ran into. They didn't have GPS to direct their movements. It's not like today, they didn't have Google Maps. They were just running, you know, to be able to escape from slave raiders. Is there a way that these rocks could tell us stories that have not been written? The guava tree is an important tree, as I try to show you here, because it's found in most of the savanna areas. It's a very big tree, and usually some of the guava tree have holes in them, openings, very, very big openings. In fact, wild animals usually would hide in these openings. But at the time when slavery became quite endemic, you have communities and you have people running to hide in these spaces. Ironically, it was also under these guava trees that most transactions took place. Slaves were chained under these trees. Transactions were done under these trees. And in fact, in Salaga, for example, there is a particular guava tree where slaves were buried when they died whilst they were waiting for transatlantic shipment. So that place has literally become a burial ground, or if you want, lack of a better word, a cemetery. And it's still under the guava tree. What is it about this guava tree that has commanded so much attention from enslaved? Is there some spirituality about the guava tree that makes it very convenient for transactions to be done under it? Because there are other trees, and Africa has a lot of other trees. Why is the guava tree such an important space? I guess that maybe with time and with further research, it is possible for us to get into community memories and find out why the guava tree is so important. I come to another important space, and this space also has the potential to tell us a lot that we do not know. And in this space, what I try to do is to be able to develop a chapter from this space. This space is called Asem Manso. And I'm trying to look at the ways we can reconfigure and to rethink and to re-understand the concept of an indigenous African Middle Passage. Because usually when we talk about the Middle Passage within the context of transatlantic slavery, we are talking about the shipment of Africans from Africa through the high seas in ships to America and the New World. But in Africa, there were many crossings before the bigger crossing. When slave raiders and when slave dealers and buyers went to the interior to buy slaves, they often ferried them across rivers and streams before they eventually ended up in the ships. And yet, when we talk about the Middle Passage, we usually do not think that it is important for us to reflect on the need for an indigenous Middle Passage. And what I am attempting to do here is to get us to reflect on the need to reconceptualize an African indigenous Middle Passage. Asem Manso is important because Asem Manso is a town that is on the way is a little bit of a center. From the north where slaves are captured to Salaga, to Kumasi, then they are moving closer to the castles. Asamanso is situated between the highway of Kumasi in the Ashanti region. These things, they look quite vague, but maybe I'm trying to ignite your imagination. When you go, you can Google some of these things and you can find. So from Asamanso to Cape Coast and to Elmina Castle is about 45 kilometers. And this was where slaves took their last bath before they ended up in the castles. So there's a stream and there's a water that flows in this particular space. So usually when people come to Ghana and they go to the castles, they are usually said, have you been to Asamanso before? Why? Because Asamanso is so central to the construction of African diasporan identity. Because it's usually the site that is said to be the place where slaves had their last bath. From having trekked for close to, I'm not a geographer, so it's very, when I get back, I'm going to get the people from geography to try to let us understand distance from Paga to Salaga to Asamanso, and how long it would have taken slaves or captives to walk that distance. By the time they would have gotten to Asamanso, many of them would have perished on the way, out of exhaustion, out of hunger, out of thirst. But the few that would survive to this place, they were lucky enough to have their final bath before they were taken to the castles. What is it about this space that we do not know? My disappointment, and well, maybe disappointment is so a harsh word, is the fact that we have turned these places into tourist sites where people just go, yeah, this is where the past. But I think that rather than thinking about the tourism potential of these spaces for me are sacred sites. Sites where we have to think again about the nature of the African Middle Passage, if there is anything at all like that. But if we have been able to invent the Middle Passage from Africa to America through ships, this Middle Passage was through foot. People had to walk. And I think that was also very traumatic because, like I said from the beginning, anytime we are talking about the trauma of transatlantic enslavement, we usually keep talking about the trauma as it affected those who ended up on the ships. If you had to walk for three weeks or 3 months in order to be able to get to the castle. Today, if you go to this site, you are going to meet, I didn't have permission to publish his photo, so that is why I've cut portions of him. When I go back and I get his permission in my book, probably I will get his photo. He's a kind of a tall guy at Asamanso who is beginning to become like a priest. I don't know whether he's been called by the gods to be a priest or not, but he usually will recount the story of Asamanso. And these stories are not really different from what historians have written already. F.K. Bois, most of the famous historians, colonial historians, Ghanaian historians have written extensively about this space. So the stories that they would usually tell us are not different from what we have heard. But what is unique about these spaces is whether we can begin to ask questions. What did the trees hear? The groans, the wailings, the sorrow songs and the dirges that captains probably sang whilst they were waiting to be marched to the castles. How do we reconfigure some of these dirges? They haven't survived. Is there ways by which we can speculate through speculative imagination? And I know that historians are not too fascinated about speculative imagination. But for those of us who do literature, at least we have the poetic license to be able to speculate of what it must have been. What did they wash away? And every year I take my students to this place. And last year when I took my students there and I asked the question, I said, so what story do you hear these streams tell you? And one of them said, sir, I think the water would have washed so many stories away. But indeed, apart from the streams, the trees would have also preserved some of the stories. If we hear intimately, what might we hear? Now, what this tour guide does when African Americans from the diaspora come to this place is to try to retrace their steps and perform rituals of return home. Because most African Americans who come back to Ghana, they come back in an attempt to make sense of their ancestral history and to trace their roots. And for that matter, when you go to the castles, there's usually a door of no return. But when they come back voluntarily, they go through certain rituals here, and they say they are rituals of return. And so within this space, in 1998, when Ghana was celebrating, an important space they call the Emancipation Day, is a political occasion that was marked the, I think, the 200th centenary of the celebration of abolition of slavery. So 2 people from the diaspora were brought and buried in this space, one from Jamaica, the other one from the US. When you go to Asemanso, their names are written and their bones have been interred in that space to signify the return home, that they were taken away by force, but that their ancestors have brought them back and they have been buried in their ancestral land. And so in this space, if you don't go there as a tourist and you go there and you want to listen, would you hear stories from the enslaved? Then finally, from Asemanso, they were taken to the castles. And I know the castles have become popular because almost everybody or most people who have read about the history of the transatlantic slave trade would usually come across the castles. Elmina, Anamabo, and Cape Coast. Now remember that historically, the castles were not originally meant for slaves. They were European fortifications. Indeed, they were originally conceived as trading posts. And when the slave trade became profitable, the architectural designs were reconfigured in order to make them accommodate captives. So within these castles, you have spaces that they call dungeons or prisons where African slaves were kept. And if you were to take a tour in some of these dungeons, you would still find the horrendous experience that these African captives went through. Some of the spaces are so small, and some of them could house about between 600 to 400 captives, male dungeons, female dungeons. And in fact, Anumabo Castle is unique because it is only in Anumabo Castle you have a dungeon for slaves between the ages of 16 and 23. So children had a dungeon in Anumabo Castle. Now, these castles have generated a lot of scholarly interest and debate because they have become important spaces where historical memory is constructed about slavery and the experience of slavery, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. But is that all we know about the slave castles? Beyond the numbers that we are told, like I just gave you numbers a while ago about how many went out from Anumabo, how many left Cape Coast Castle. But beside these numbers, what else do we know? Or what else can we know? What else, what other stories are we able to hear? And so I'm crafting a chapter looking at the spaces in the castle, and the title of that chapter is What the Castles Do Not Tell Us. Hearing the Unsaid. That's the title of the chapter. Hearing the Unsaid, What the Castles Do Not Tell Us. Because I believe that there is still a lot of hidden stories within these castles that we do not know. The rape and the abuse of women, all of that has already been written. But I guess that there are a lot of intimate details that women are not able to share. These stories have not survived in the archives. They haven't survived in the travel logs. How are we going to make sense of some of these stories? I am not in any way admitting that this is a very straightforward methodology. There are indeed challenges with trying to listen in the silences, trying to listen in the gaps, trying to make sense of what cannot be made sense of because of the enormous nature or the tragedy that usually follows this history. So all of these castles you will find, in fact, there are a lot more castles within the Gold Coast, like I told about 60 of them, but these ones have survived because they have become World Heritage or UNESCO. UNESCO has designated these ones as World Heritage sites, and so they have become so important. And so they still continue to resonate within the Ghanaian collective imagination. So let me conclude by saying that although we have read a lot, we probably would have heard a lot, but I believe that there is still a lot that we do not know. And it is my argument that indeed, some of the things we do not know are still hidden and they are still buried. And some sites that have not even yet been uncovered. I was just talking to a colleague today over lunch that indeed there are still spaces in northern Ghana where when you visit the spaces, they just tell you this was a whole community. It has now been decimated. There is no human presence anymore. How do we recover those hidden sites? And what stories may we learn from some of these sites? What archaeologists do when they go to these sites is that they just start digging to uncover what has been buried in the past. But after digging, what else can we find? Thank you for your attention. So, Dr. Lakisha, you have given me an assignment, and I hope that maybe I've done 5% of it.
Time for a few questions.
Some suggestions, reactions, clarifications. I have a pen, I'm a student, I'm still learning. So don't forget about the title of professor.
Yeah.
Yes, were you UCC? No,
No.
Okay.
But I've heard a lot about you.
like seriously, pay me for hearing about me.
That's why
Okay, thank you. I hope they are good things. They are not bad things. Some bad, some good. I get. Okay.
Do some of the songs and dirges, do they mention the trees, the roles or the stories the trees have? Or
They do not, and that is why I thought that there was a need to do, although my second book is not necessarily a sequel of the first one, but it in a lot of ways try to look at the gaps that still exist in our knowledge. Because at the time I was doing this, my focus was just on the songs, expressive culture. You know, because usually when I go to the field and I say, so in what ways do you still remember this history? What kept coming almost all the time is that we still have songs that we used to remember. And on what occasions do we perform these songs? They'll tell you, well, these are sacred, they are considered as sacred songs because their themes are usually very sorrowful and they are emotive. So we don't just perform these songs for performance sake. We usually remember and perform these songs when important people within the community die. So it is during funerals of important people that we use these songs, or during our festivals, because in some of these communities, you have festivals that are predicated on resistance. So it is only during these periods that you would find these songs being performed. So you just don't go into the community and say, can you sing a song about slavery for me? No, it's an intimate history. So at the time, I was so much focused on expressive culture. But I think now I'm beginning to think again, is there a way by which we can look at intangible culture, material culture? And that is where this idea of the tree came from. Because the interest in this tree is because consistently the tree has featured in almost all the narratives. From Picoro to, I didn't mention one location, it's called Sapili. Sapili is in the northern region actually. When you are coming from Picoro, Sapili is on the way. And if you go to Sapili, you will still find a boabua tree. And they take you to the tree and they said, this was the tree under which slaves were chained and they were sold. So I became curious. What is it about this tree? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, I said, what is it about this tree that almost all the time there are transactions under this tree and you have to change it? Because there are other trees that are, well, maybe the idea will be there because it's very big, but of course there are other big trees. So that is how come I started now beginning to ask questions and to see, is there a way by which maybe people who are quite knowledgeable in the history can tell us that, well, there's some spirituality about it. I'm just speculating that there is something about the tree that we do not know that we ought to be thinking about. And that is how come I'm trying to look at the tree again. Now, but even beyond the tree, when you go to Salaga, you still find trails. Whether they are the original trails or not is difficult to tell, but they would take you to the side and say, these are examples of places where the captives walked. You'll still find evidence of those trails there. But today, because of human activity and people are building and environmental degradation and all of that, we are beginning to lose some of these sites. And that is why I think it is important to do these kind of projects, to be able to document these things before eventually they get lost, because some of the sites are getting lost. I mean, you get to a space now and they tell you that this place used to be a slave site, and somebody has put up an executive mansion there. It has become a lorry park now. Today, if you go to the Salaga market, it's now a lorry park. A week before I came to the US, I went back there, and the government of Ghana is trying to redevelop it and make it a tourist attraction. So they are going to put statues there, and now it's looking more presentable. Have you been to Salaga? Have you been to Salaga? Okay. So they are now trying to make it presentable, to make it attractive to tourists, not to scholars, but to tourists. Well, that's fine.
That perfect segue to my question. First of all, thank you very much for this work and for sharing it with us. I have a kind of difficult question. It's difficult work. It's a difficult topic. Just what you were just talking about with these sites, these spaces, having many functions and meaning different things to different people. I guess that's what I want to know how you feel and think about that, how we reconcile, a space. I remember visiting Almina, and some of us were there mourning and trying to repair. Some were working, some were on holiday, and it was a recreational place, and they were taking photos in a way which you would, any kind of this monument to kind of show that you were there, but the connection was very different for the place. So for some of it was a sacred place, for some of it was a business, for some of it was recreational entertainment space, and for some will be a site of scholarly inquiry because it's interesting and they understand the importance of it from a scholarly perspective. So I just want to know how you feel about that. What do we do with spaces like that? What do we do in spaces like that, especially when it's someone like you or me who are going to occupy it in multiple ways at once? I just wanted to kind of.
For me, it's a very difficult history because, like I said from the beginning, my ancestors were people who were raided in the latter part of the 19th century by Zabarman and Asante raiders. And so for me, I come into this field with an intimate connection with the people. So anytime I go to a Sanmanso and I go to the castles, I see my ancestors. Even if, today we're talking about numbers, and with the kind of work she's done so far, the numbers are quite significant. We are able to trace people from Paga, and from Paga to my village is just about maybe 2 kilometers. So for me, it's quite a traumatic experience. And as an academic who is working in the South, I mean, here it's much easier to talk about racism because of color distinctions. In Africa, we don't talk about racism, but we talk about ethnicities and how ethnicities complicates identity formation. So by mere fact that I come from the North, suppose that I come from an inferior caste. And that is a very difficult history. So people deal with you not on the basis of what you qualify for, but on the basis of your past history. Just like they see a Black person in America and they say your ancestors were slaves. So do they see some people from Northern Ghana and they say your ancestors were slaves. It's a very complicated history. At the attainment of independence, in my first book, I think I mentioned that, when most African countries got independence, the single most important project was to now say, well, colonialism is in the past and slave trade is in the past. Let's think about national unity. So we now began to construct narratives of unity and the need to forge ahead. And Kwame Nkrumah was very articulate about continental African unity and all of that. And so within Ghana, he tried to be able to get ethnic groups to think beyond the experience of slavery and the past. And that is how come he encouraged the boarding school system. And so if you were to go to school, high school in the North, you are likely to get people coming from different ethnicities. It was a way by which Kwame Nkrumah wanted to break bridges. But that does not mean that still these subtle differences of the ordering us and them and all of that, they still exist. And so slave ancestry, and that is why there's a lot of silences regarding, now these silences are being broken because the slave trade has generated a lot of interest. I was telling somebody that it's just not a scholarly enterprise, it's an industry. People are making fortunes out of this history. But otherwise, it's an emotive history. And the kind of advantage that some of us have as continental Africans working on this kind of history is because we have an intimate connection with the people so they can trust us with information. Because we speak the language and that offers a certain kind of analytic advantage. Unlike people who they consider as strangers to the culture. So anytime I asked the question and they were deviating, because I understood the language, I could easily come back and say, no, this is what I meant, this is not what I meant. Although still there are gaps, there are problems with translation, and there are weaknesses associated with the methodology, but at least you are able to get pieces and fragments together to make sense. So for me, it's a very challenging history. And I remember when I went to Britain and I started this project, my PhD advisor, who was white, Professor David Richardson, is a transatlantic historian. He's written quite extensively. He told me categorically that, look, Saboro, you are going to have a lot of problems with your continental African brothers because this is something they don't want to talk about. And you seem to you want to resurrect something that we are trying to forget. And true to his word, I have not had support from the continent. People are really not interested in this kind of issue. Why are you something, what is it about? What is that you are trying to do? So that is part of it. Because for most of the people who wrote the history of Gold Coast and the history of the slave trade in Gold Coast were of dominant account origins, whose ancestors were complicit in the raiding. So you don't expect that they will write anything favorable about the experience of slavery. Or even if they did, they will romanticize the experience. Is that the correct word to do? Yeah, they usually romanticize it. And so, African slavery was benign. It was less oppressive than transatlantic slavery. African slavery, a slave could buy property and marry. And so you see in Africa, but if you were sacrificing slaves to accompany chiefs, human sacrifice cannot be benign. So you have Akosia Pepe, who has written an excellent text, but I don't agree with most of the things she says about the relative benign nature of African slavery because you are trying to compare that to American plantation slavery. The two are structurally different. If somebody was to, I just told you about the distance, although I don't have any idea about what constitutes distance from places of capture to the castle. Somebody would have to walk for maybe 3 months in one tattered dress. If she was a female and she was in her menstrual flow, you can imagine what would happen before she gets to a summer. So do you call that benign? Any slave tried to resist, you were shot and killed, and your corpse will lie, and vultures will have to feed on your corpse. Do you know the kind of importance that Africans play or put on death and mourning and funeral rites? That we had people who were torn by wild animals and their flesh was thrown over the place, never had burial. Is that benign? Because they didn't end up on plantations? Do you know what it means for women to be raped in the bush? When we consider land in Africa as a sacred space, that you can't have sex anywhere, and that a slave master could abuse and violate a woman in the bush and leave her for dead, is that benign? That scorpions and snakes could just bite people, didn't have anti-snake venoms? Is that how you call them? No enslaver was interested in having an anti-snake venom. Although in Africa we know that certain herbs could, help with snake bites. But who was interested in the welfare of a slave? Except that the captives were, the only time an enslaver was interested in the welfare of a captive was because you were a profit, you were a commodity. And so he would ensure that you ended up in the castles as safe. But are we saying that all of these cruel treatments are considered as benign? And so that has been the kinds of debates that African historians have tried to, well, if you consider the structural representations of African American slavery on plantations, is on another level. But you cannot say that because they didn't end up on the plantations in America, African slavery was. I have challenged this thesis and I will continue to challenge this thesis. You should be the last to speak because You are a co-researcher.
I mean, it's, okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to meet you in person for the very first time. And I also do research in this area of transatlantic slavery, but from a historical perspective, and also from a descendant perspective, as the descendant of Euro-African merchants who were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. So I think the point on African or pre-colonial Ghanaian forms of bondage as being benign is also a polemical point, not just by African historians, but also from African diaspora historians who use that as a polemical point against against Atlantic slavery in the Americas. So I think that's something that also fed into the nationalist historiography. But I think by the 80s, the sort of integrated model of enslaved people into the household, by the 80s, it was already being challenged. And then I was also thinking about how you authenticate sites that people allege to be connected.
That's important.
In my own research, as you rightly mentioned, it's become an industry, so people just lie about stuff just to make money.
Yeah, that's right.
So as a historian, I'm very skeptical about these things. So for me, I don't even sort of draw a wedge between critical archival research and memories, because a lot of the archival research, a lot of the archaeologists also, somebody like John Mason, he's a very amazing historical archaeologist who combines both ethnography with historical research, and he's been able to unearth a lot, right? So I'll suggest that a sort of robust interdisciplinary and also intermethodological approach could get us closer. And already there are quite a number of monographs in the last 10 years that really discusses this beyond Acquisition 30, of course, that really discusses these in a much more robust way. And then finally, where I come from, there is a street called the Orphan Street, right, in Ghana, Hausa. So, and people were shackled there as they awaited to sort of disembark finally to the ports. So I think if we could probably broaden the points of exit of the slave routes beyond Asimman. So again, this is also a product of the tourist economy, right? Because it's Asimman is the only way, right? But then
there was, like I said, there were several crossings.
Yeah, but then the Accra and the southeastern Gold Coast had become a major point of the illegal slave trade after 1807, because returning Afro-Brazilians who had been enslaved in Brazil also returned to revive the illegal slave trade. So Accra and the southeastern Gold Coast to Togo, Benin, and Lagos was a major corridor. So I think if we probably broaden the scope, you would get so many sort of ethnographic insights as well as historical insights.
Yeah, indeed. One historian, Dumet, even has uncovered a slave plantation around the Kogo areas. And in fact, he says that there were kinds of, cocoa, palm nut plantations where slaves were, but we don't even hear of that. And even in Elmina, there was a kind of a plantation, but I'm not sure that kind of plantation is American kind of plantation. But indeed, these were sites. Now, to talk about authentication, I mean, it's a very valid point because now that the story of slavery has become an industry, sometimes it's good to be careful about sites and not just lump all of them as sites that are connected to slavery. But one of the things that is quite insightful is that if you go to the field, you would find that you still have communities where some of the artifacts were retrieved from slave raiders. I mean, who out of desperation, or some of them when they were resisted, they left some of those and they gathered them. There are sacred sites. There is one in Sandema. Sandema is in the Upper East, not far away from Paga. There is a sacred grove where it's actually a shrine now. If you go to that shrine, they will recount to you the history and the history of resistance. You will still find bangles that were retrieved from the slave raiders. And when I first heard the story about the bangles who were retrieved from slave raiders, their wives, I said, what were women doing in slave raiding? You know, but so you still find chains and you still find some of these places, some of these things that are kept in some of these spaces. So I agree. It is not all the spaces that you usually could say that this is a slave site. And it is always good to check back to the historical record because indeed we still have historical documents that support some of the sites. And so, but the local communities also are usually able to point to certain sites that have not even been documented. So I think it's a very valid point that it is important that we broaden the scope because Asamas was not actually the only river that slaves probably would have crossed. But yet it has become the place that everybody is talking about. And this guy I was talking to, he has turned himself into a priest. I don't know where he had his training from, you know, and he's trying to perform rituals. And we go there and he says, remove your shoes. You were meant to remove your shoes.
We were asked.
You know, and he tells white people to stand at one side and black people at another side, and he tells the black people that they are coming to bath, and it's like, really? What is all of this? So there are challenges, and that is why it's important for us to keep critiquing some of these things. Because when I take my students there and he's telling the story, sometimes it's very uncomfortable I'm there. Because he realizes that indeed there are some of the stories he's saying that I know he's read from books, and sometimes they don't add up. But this is where the guy is getting his daily bread from. So I can't say you are lying, so I just have to keep quiet. But then when I write, maybe I keep to raise some of these critiques and some of these things. So I think that, and that is why discussions like this are important, because somebody would have seen a book, somebody would have read something and say, can you look at this work? And I think all of these things will enrich the kind of discussions that we are having going forward, because we would never be able to exhaust the stories that we have heard and the ones it is not possible we can exhaust. Our methodological approaches will certainly always be different. And that is why, like you rightly said, I do a lot of methodologies. I don't see myself as a core historian, although I had my training in the history department. I also do a lot of literature. And literature, we are allowed a license to speculate. Although historians are not too happy about speculation, but in literature we can say, so what is it that is in the interior monologue of characters? What is it that this character would have been thinking? We allow that. Historians, if you don't allow that, well, that's your problem. Anyway, so Professor, you wanted to add? Yes.
I just wanted to say, I think, thank you so much for this talk. I just wonder if there can't be a difference between the speculative methodologies around the built environment and the speculative methodologies around the natural environment. And I'm remembering things that I've read about a rubber tree that refused that, and you had to know its biology to know why it would grow in the wild, but there's a version of the rubber tree that will not grow on a plantation. It just won't grow under certain conditions. And I'm just thinking that as you're listening and thinking about the speculations that you're doing, there's something about the particular life of a baobab tree that makes it different, as you said, from other trees. Why, how does this tree grow? Where are its roots? How deep are they? How does it both give life to itself as a space and as a living thing, which, I mean, that seems to me to require a different set of tools
That's right.
than analyzing a castle,
That's
for
right.
example. So I wonder.
That's right.
if
You're
that's
right. Yeah, that's right. You're right.
those things-
You're right. But I mean, it's important because I was becoming curious because almost everywhere you went, the guava tree was featured. And for me, I thought that, well, beyond its biology or beyond its agricultural thing, is there a spirituality to it? I mean, so these are things that probably with a lot of questions and research we probably could find out.
That's a
Yeah.
good one of the trees.
Yeah.
Because historically, our societies did not confine business.
That's right.
So people were putting laws.
Yeah, that's right.
Trees.
And
were-
change, yes, that's right.
people were-
Yeah,
So basically, even criminals were
Mm.
shackled to trees.
that's right. That's true. Yes.
It's interesting, it's obviously far away, but in like South Africa, all the way to Zambia, like bareback trees are really, really important to us. Like my papa used to say that the bareback, it like offended the gods and like they picked it up and they threw it upside down. That's why it looks like it's roots are top.
Mhm.
But he used to say, if you want to hide things from the ancestors, you must do it under the bareback tree. But it wasn't just those dualistic like bad trees.
So that's a
right?
spirituality of
Yeah,
it.
but if you ate its leaves, like, or you bathed your sons in the waters by the bareback trees, they'll grow tall and strong. So it has this like very important purpose.
Yeah. And in fact, its fruit is edible. In northern Ghana, they eat its fruit. The leaves are even used to prepare soup. You know, yeah, so yes, and I think that resonates with the kind of curiosity that I'm beginning to think about. There must be something about it that beyond its zoology, it's possible for us to begin to ask questions. And I think that the ancestors and the old people before they die, they should be able to tell us some of these things for us to document. Because I'm beginning to become very jittery that most of them are dying and they may die with this kind of histories. And unfortunately, like you and I were discussing in your office, a lot of the young people are no longer interested in this kind of history. They want to do economics and they want to do finance and accounting, and they are really not interested in the guava tree and the castle. So what? You know, does it bring food to our table? You know.
Yeah, you mentioned you're in conversation with multiple disciplines, and I really enjoyed the way you're laying this out as someone who works in tourism is one of my things. But you're also in conversation with performance studies,
Yeah.
especially Diana Taylor's
That's right.
work on the archive and the repertoire. And
Who's what?
Diana Taylor.
Please write it for me, okay?
Sure. Oh, it's a wonderful book on the archive and the repertoire, precisely this critique of what has been saved by whom.
That's right.
And what has not been saved by whom, and how we can use the other forms of practice
Of
as
practice.
a form of the archive. And I just wondered if you had those conversations, because I think a lot of people in performance studies would be very
Good,
interested.
good. That's important. That's important. So I'm writing that reference down. Ever since I got to Bloomington, Indiana, I think I'm carrying, my bag is becoming heavy with books. I've bought more than 10 books I'm carrying home. You know, and she was kind enough to give me one book yesterday. And so thank her for that Kisha for me. Yes, so now I think you wanted
Can I
to.
ask my question?
Yes, you can.
So like, fortunately, like I feel privileged that I have the ability to have asked for, but I'll just ask one. Okay, so my questions, a lot of my questions are around how receptive Ghanaians are, and you talked about like not getting the support from certain areas, and you know, I talked to you also about the reason why we worked in Northern Ghana because they were open about talking about this issue, whereas in other places they weren't. So I need to tell you the story to ask the question. So we went to the stock pooling, and you know, like some of the places we went to, rather than being raided, they were the raiders, right? And so like a few generations back, you know, they were the raiders and their kids grew up stocky that they would be trained to be raiders. And so and this one particular visit, you know, the person went back and dressed up as a chief, you know, in traditional garment, and then came back and was very proud about it. And, you know, I understand that I'm there as a researcher and I'm there as a, you know, study abroad, you know, co-leader, but I'm also there as an African American person. And so all of these things, like, I needed to understand, like, do you understand who I am in this particular narrative, right? In this story, because like, you're proud of this moment, and I'm like, this is, you know, and so after conversation with them, it came to this, and he said, like, we suffered enough. So his idea was, yeah, we social all, we rated our neighboring communities, we sold, people love and things like that, but look at us now, we're poor, not everywhere in Ghana, just this particular place, right? And we're struggling, and can you give us, fees for like school supplies and things like this, right? And so I'm saying that part of it, just really get your advice about how to engage in these types of conversations, because they are like willing to talk about it. But I also saw where they were the raiders, and then we visited a place that was raided, and the person from the village that was raided went to the throne of the raiders and just sat there and just hanging out, right? And then the chief was like, they didn't do anything to this person. To me, you go to like somebody's office or whatever, I'm not gonna go and sit in that person's chair, right? And so the way that they handled the relationship between raiders and raiders and raided that were neighbors was that the raided person is allowed to come and do whatever they want to the raiders, even to sit on the throne and there, right? And I just thought it was a really interesting way of dealing with that history, the complicated history.
It's a very complicated history.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, because of the different ethnicities that we have in Ghana and Africa, usually it is important to engage with the history a little bit more deeper. Because if you look at late 19th century slave raiding, when Barbatu and Gazari and Samori came into, they were enlisted as mercenaries by the Dagombes in order for the Dagombes to be able to fulfill their annual tribute to Asante. That was what the historical record tells us. And so the Dagombes, historically, are known to be warriors who aided Barbatu and his team to go on into raiding the decentralized communities. And usually when historians talk about decentralized communities, they are talking about the areas that, we are familiar with, the Bunsa, Kasna, Frafra areas. Those are usually the areas that are regarded as decentralized society. In fact, the Dogomans themselves consider themselves as a kingdom, close to the Asante kingdom. That's how they see themselves. And the Dogombes and the Gonjes, they see themselves as warrior kingdoms. So if you look at the history of Ghana, apart from Asante, the next kingdoms that we talk about and we celebrate are the Moni Dagbani kingdom and then the Gonja kingdom. And these were warriors who helped Barbatu, and in fact were also helping some of the Asante leaders to raid. But of course, post-colonial Ghana, like we are talking, I mean, the issues about let's forge forward. Let's stop all of this history about who raided who and who were victims and who were perpetrators. Today, all of these people live in the same communal space. I mean, even though we don't talk about it, but people know who was of a slave ancestry. They know who was the raided, and they know who were the victims, and they know who were the perpetrators. All of these things are part of the local law. Just that they are not spoken about. They only become important when people are contesting for traditional, positions. Then they begin to go back to your ancestor and say, look, if you are a descendant of a slave, you do not qualify to ascend the throne. And I'll tell you a very interesting story that I'm using for a book chapter, where I'm trying to look at race formations in Africa, but try to let us think about race through the ethnicity medium. Because when we talk about race, usually we are talking about race using the American frame based on skin color. There is a ways in which we understand race in Africa quite differently through the ethnicity medium. And so there is this political, lady in Ghana who in 2012 was contesting for a parliamentary seat from the Brown Hafu region. And people within her own party said, your history suggests that you are a descendant of a slave. So you cannot stand for, you cannot be an MP whilst we have a royal. A royal means somebody who legitimately comes from the place. But all along she knew that, she actually came from the place. So she began to research into her ancestry, only for her to discover that her great-grandmother was from the Kuyama in the Upper West region, who was bought as a slave and brought to the south and brought to Techima. The woman was so beautiful that the enslaver decided to marry her and eventually gave birth to her mother. So she comes from the slave ancestor, but never knew this until she was contesting for political office. So this is how ethnicity complicates identity formation within Ghana. So although we don't talk about race in terms of skin color, because we are all Black people, but we know who raided whom and who comes from where. Tomorrow, if I want to be president of Ghana, they said, but were you not the people whose ancestors were raided? How can you suddenly say you want to become a president? So these are unspoken discourses, but they still form part of our popular culture. They are still part of the movies we watch. The characters we cast in our movies usually are still framed through ethnocentric lenses. The jobs, in the past, you'll find most Northerners, because they didn't have access to formal education, were usually the janitors and the security men and the watchmen, and they were the conservative laborers and all of that kind of stuff. And so even when movie producers began to cast some of these people in movies, the managing director or the boss of a company is an Ashanti or a Ga. But the houseboy or the housemaid or the domestic servant is somebody who is from the North.
One more person. So then, okay, so,
Yeah.
testing, doing DNA tests, I'm finding that I'm related to a person in product.
Good.
And maybe have a lower status, right? So then, part of my question,
Yeah.
Crystal, is what would that mean, politically, in terms of, their status? There's, multiple layers here. There's one related to a person from anywhere outside of Africa. But then also, what if, my status as a Black American could be either a lady or, does that, you know what I mean? Or just privileged because of.
That's right. Yeah, you are privileged because you are Black American.
Right, and if I'm not, then I'm lady.
That's right.
And so then, and this is
Yeah.
no, I think we understand this here. So then, okay, I'm now related to, let's say you, right?
Yeah, so you are not my relative.
Right.
You come from my village.
So then does that give you more status as you're trying to deal with trying to buy things? Because it was an actual question from people that
So the problem about this kind of identity framing is that usually, well, of course, we have had these kinds of things in America because, like I said, American, it's quite obvious because of, color distinctions. You are Black, you are Black, you are white, you are white. Those distinctions those binary categorizations are very straightforward and very clear. In Africa, these binary categorizations are not clear, except that sometimes they ask, what is your name? And your name is usually a window to where you're coming from. And then, which part of Ghana do you come from? And you say, well, I am from Paga. Oh, yeah. Really? Then you know what follows? So now, in the Ghana's Fourth Republic, Northerners have risen to high political offices. In fact, Dr. Hilary Mann was from Gulu in the Upper West. He became president just for a few months. This was somebody who was trained in France. Eventually, the political party brought him, he won election. He was one of the people that Rawlings, toppled in the revolution. Now, fast forward from Hilary Mann, we have John Mahama, who is a Gonja, who is from the North, who became leader of the NDC and became president of Ghana. Now, the current vice president of Ghana, Bamuya, is a Mamprisi, also from the North. So two Northerners now are competing for political office.
But it would be from the dominant.
They all come from the dominant areas. So-called, because especially Mahama is coming from a warrior group. But that in itself does not legitimize him. Because you still have conversations behind the scenes that say, well, why would you vote for a Northerner as a president? So those very subtle discussions and some of those, things still happen. But when you come, you are coming as a researcher, you are usually not too much concerned about these. For those of us who live and work there, and we have living experiences, there are ways in which sometimes we are even affected by virtue. There are certain academic positions before, it doesn't really matter whether you're a professor or you are published, nobody cares. They really care about where are you coming from. These are very emotionally charged and very sensitive issues that usually we don't want to talk about. And it's very, very convenient to say, there is racism in America. But it's not convenient to say that ethnicity is a medium for marginalization and for discrimination of people from certain ethnic groups by virtue of their ancestry or by virtue of where they're coming from. So it's a very complicated kind of issue. It's a very complicated kind of issue. So usually when I give lectures like this and there are people who come from account dominant groups and they are listening, they are usually very embarrassed. I remember there was a study abroad program that they came, one professor brought, there's a lady who is Ghanaian but has been working and living in the US. And she came and when I was speaking, she said, "Oh, I am an Asante, but I didn't know this history." I said, "Why would you know this history? Because these are not things that are taught in schools." You wouldn't know this history. And so usually some of them get very embarrassed. Those of them who don't get embarrassed get very defensive and they try to say, well, we're not that bad, we're traders. The slave trade was profitable to both the buyers and the sellers. So Africans were as complicit as white people. And they make jokes. But these things are not things to joke about. They are serious, emotional, sensitive living issues that you cannot joke about them. And yet you have some continental Africans who joke about this. For me, it's not a joke thing because I have been affected by these kinds of politics of marginalization just by virtue of my ethnicity. So yeah.
It's a key point.
Yes.
I think the history curriculum, slavery is actually celebrated, right? They don't call them slave raiding, but they call them state expansion and greatness.
That's right. That's what historians call them.
Typical history of
Ghana
textbook.
Yeah.
You see sort of map of Ghana.
Yeah.
With the Asante Empire,
Good.
which is bigger than the modern Republic of Ghana,
That's right.
Togo, Ivory Coast, and then we'll just say 1742.
Yeah.
Conquered.
That's right.
1750, Gonja.
Conquered.
So
and then when they fought the British, so
then that becomes the sort of Asante triumph. And then we were the ones who fought the British. You guys were just,
that's right.
Not.
Yeah.
So you are not strong enough.
That's right.
We fought the British. Then so that's what climaxes, history of Ghana prior to the 20th century.
Yeah.
In the textbooks.
Yeah. So J.K. Finn has a book he published in 1974, Asante and His Neighbors. And he says the opening paragraph is that the history of the Gold Coast is essentially the history of Asante and His Neighbors. That's the opening paragraph. The history of the Gold Coast is essentially the history of Asante and His Neighbors. The dominant historiography of the Gold Coast is essentially the history of Asante and its expansion. Like you rightly said, Asante's expansionist moves. They usually would not talk about slavery. If you look at Ghana's foremost historian, the late Professor Dubois, he's very respected because he's one of the earliest to have gotten foreign education. He came and he became a professor of history. If you read almost all his works, the emphasis, what he writes about is the transatlantic slave trade. You don't find anything about slave raiding and all of this kind of stuff.
But I think beyond those people, the scholarship has also.
It has expanded. I'm using that example because he was one of Ghana's foremost historians that people cite, and people respect him a lot because he was a trailblazer in the study of history in Ghana or even in Africa. Anyway.
The conversation. Please feel free to hang out with some refreshments on the table down there if you'd like to carry on talking.
I would want to provide the site sources again. Yeah, I want
they're.
Yeah.